As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Israel intensified airstrikes in Rafah on Wednesday as Israeli officials are threatening to invade the city, which is packed with an estimated 1.5 million Palestinians. So Reuters reported that the Israeli bombardment in Rafah killed over a dozen members of the same family. That's the Al-Noor family in strikes on a building. And that includes a 1.5-year-old girl who was killed in the strikes. At the site of the bombed house, Palestinians were actually criticizing the U.S. for vetoing the ceasefire at the UN Security Council and just for its support of Israel in general, the U.S. support for the massacre that's happening inside Gaza. So I thought that was interesting. And this is, again, according to Reuters. They quoted someone named Yusuf Sheikh Al-Eid, who said, quote, "Since October 7th and until this moment, the U.S. has been supporting Israel with rockets, aircrafts, and tanks. All of these massacres are because of America," end quote. And I think it's important for Americans to understand, who might not think this is any of our concern, the situation that's happening in Gaza, that like many of these conflicts around the world that the U.S. is involved in, to the people being bombed, they're very much at war with the United States as well as Israel. It was the same thing in Yemen when the U.S. was backing the Saudi UAE coalition against the Houthis. If you ever read Houthi media, they always called the Saudi airstrikes U.S.-Saudi aggression is how they refer to it. So Gaza's health ministry said that a total of 118 Palestinians were killed in Gaza from February 20th to the 21st, and that includes Rafah and elsewhere. And that brings the death toll up to 29,313, with 69,333 others wounded. So a huge number of wounded Palestinians, and about 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. And again, this doesn't include the thousands of people who are missing and presumed to be under the rubble. So Israeli officials also said that they intensified operations in the nearby city of Khan Yunis, where Israeli forces are fighting Hamas on the ground. Fighting also continues up in northern Gaza, where the Israeli Defense Forces said one of its soldiers was killed on Wednesday. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has threatened that Israel will invade Rafah by Ramadan, which begins on March 10th, if Hamas does not release the remaining Israeli captives. If Israel launches a full-scale invasion of Rafah, it'll be a massacre because of just it's just packed with people, with civilians living and sleeping on the streets. And so Gantz is saying that we'll invade if there's no hostage deal, if they don't release hostages. Right now, the prospects of a deal being reached don't look very good, although Gantz did say on Wednesday that there are early signs of possible progress. But that's just Gantz. I wouldn't give too much credit to that unless we start seeing that, from other sides. If we see Qatar saying that there's progress. So far, I'm just seeing Gantz say that. So the Israeli Knesset has overwhelmingly backed a resolution put forward by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that rejects a unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. So 99 lawmakers out of 120 in the Knesset voted in favor of the resolution. According to Ynet, Israel's Labor Party boycotted the vote, and 11 Arab lawmakers voted against it. The majority of the leading opposition parties, National Unity and Yesh Atid, voted in favor. Netanyahu celebrated the strong support for his legislation. He said, quote, "I commend the Knesset members, including those from the opposition, who today voted overwhelmingly in favor of my proposal that Israel opposes being unilaterally dictated to establish a Palestinian state. I don't recall many votes, in fact, hardly any, where the Knesset voted with a majority of 99, nearly 100 members out of 120 on any proposal," end quote. So this resolution, and we saw the Israeli cabinet, approved a declaration saying something similar. This came in response to these reports that the U.S. has been working on this peace deal with some Arab countries that they want to announce, unveil. And this is the response. This is Netanyahu's response. And this is not just Netanyahu's response, but almost the entire Israeli parliament's response. From the dissenter, another one from Mohammed El-Mazi, and I ran his story yesterday. He was covering it at the court. And so the U.S. on Wednesday, they had their, rebuttal to the Assange defense, and they just repeated things that they've repeated before. This claim that the way the leaks, really the big claim is that Julian Assange is not a journalist. He wasn't just being a journalist. He encouraged his source, to hack materials. And they claim, even though any journalist with sources will tell you that encouraging a source to give you a leak is not anything out of the ordinary. It's standard journalism, standard journalistic practice. They also recycled the claim that the WikiLeaks things that they published, again, and this is going back to 2010, endangered people in other countries. And this was all dealt with when Chelsea Manning went on trial, who actually leaked the documents. And they found no evidence that anybody was killed as a result of what WikiLeaks published. So anyway, the main thing here is that they went through the 2 days of the hearing, and Assange is going to have to wait on the decision. The High Court did not issue a decision. They reserved their judgment for a later date, and it could be days or weeks before they grant or deny Assange's request for an appeal hearing. Now, this is something I didn't have right, or I didn't realize, is that this is a request for an appeal hearing. So if the court grants that request, then there's going to be the actual appeal hearing. But this is, as far as his defense says, the last chance that they expect. This is the last chance. If the court denies his request for an appeal, that means extradition. I think the last resort that they have is some sort of European human rights court, but I can't see the UK, if they're determined to extradite him, really caring about that.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This article here, Donald Trump and government theft. Let's make this clear right from the start, everybody. It's not about whether you like Trump or hate Trump. It's about what's going on against Trump. And again, to make it clear, speaking only for myself, I can't stand Trump. Don't like the cat, don't like a lot of things that he's done. The assassination of Soleimani, moving the American embassy from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and not living up to his word on a lot of things that he said he was going to do. So I want to make that clear. I'm not a fan of his, but I call things the way they are, not the way I want them to be. I was the first magazine to call him a winner in May of 2016. Call the whole crisis about the impeachment a stupid joke, a moronic thing to do, knowing he wasn't going to get impeached because there would never be a majority enough to impeach him. About the whole Russiagate, a total scam. So I call it like it is, not what I want. And the same with the judge, and I'm not speaking for the judge, but his article here really makes it clear why they're going after Trump and what they're doing to him. And I just want to read a quick section here, Judge, and you take it away. You say, last week, a New York court ordered the Trump administration and its principals, including the former president, to forfeit nearly $400 million to the state government. This gargantuan punishment was not for any crime committed or harm caused by the defendants. Rather, it was government theft at its worst.
So Donald Trump borrowed money from Deutsche Bank regularly, consistently, and systematically. It was his, for years, sole lender, and then for other years, his principal lender. And he developed real estate in New York City and elsewhere. In order to borrow the money, he pledged assets that he already owned as security for the money, giving a mortgage. He paid back all the money that was borrowed, and he paid it back on time. The government came in and demanded his books and records and said, we think that the evaluation you put on a building that you pledged as security for a loan you made 10 years ago was not accurate, that you overvalued the building, and therefore you cheated Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank said, well, no, he didn't cheat us. We sent our own appraisers out there to appraise his buildings. We never accept at face value what our clients tell us, except in Trump's case, he was right. It was within a range acceptable to us. It wasn't exactly what we wanted, right down to the penny, but it never is, because the value of real estate can change every day. What's the value of a piece of real estate? What a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to pay for it. And that could be different today than it was last week and will be next week. Nevertheless, the state sued him, claiming that somehow the state suffered harm because Trump over-evaluated the assets that he pledged as security for the loan, and persuaded a judge that Trump illicitly earned $160 million, and that $160 million plus interest should be forfeited to the state. Now, we have a principle of law in America called the harm principle. If I punch you in the nose, you can sue me because I have a duty not to touch your nose, and I breached that duty, and I harmed you in your nose. You can sue for pain and suffering and medical bills and loss of work and permanent injury if there is anybody. But if a friend of yours looks at the nose a week later and says, what happened to your nose? And you say, the judge did it to me. I'm going to sue the judge. No, that other person can't sue me because I didn't breach any duty to him. I didn't harm him. So that's effectively what happened here, except there was no nose breaking. There was no harm to the bank. The bank's executives got on the witness stand during the case and said, he paid us back every nickel we loaned him. He's one of the best clients we've had. He's the president of the United States, but if he ever goes back into this business, we'll be happy to lend him all the money he wants. And still the state persuaded a judge that somehow the state was harmed. It was a phantom harm. Now, you're an economist. You'll get a kick out of the state's claim for harm. Here's how we're harmed, the state lawyer argued. The banks loaned Trump more money than they should have. They should have loaned him less money, and therefore there would be more money in the bank for them to loan to other people, to small businesses. A, the bank doesn't lend from its reserves. It lends from the fake cash that the Federal Reserve gives to it. B, Deutsche Bank doesn't lend to small businesses. They don't make loans less than $100 million. C, the state doesn't know what the hell it's talking about because money is fungible. So if the bank overloaned to Trump, he didn't put the money in a shoebox. He's building skyscrapers, which is employing thousands of people, which is creating new wealth each time one of those condos in those skyscrapers is bought and sold and bought and sold. And the judge, without a jury, bought this nonsense, allowed Trump's assets to be seized from him. I'll explain the seizure to you in a minute if you want to hear it. In one of the greatest acts of theft in the modern era. I mean, this would make Joe Stalin blanch for all the farms that his communist government stole from Russian peasants, not wealthy people, peasants in the 1930s.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Can you say something then about, you have selections from the ancient world and then the medieval world and the Renaissance down to the present. But in the ancient world, which may seem, obviously it's temporally the most remote from us, but culturally and in every other way, probably also seems the most remote. What do they have to say? What do some of the figures that you whose selections you include have to say to us, in some cases thousands of years later, that might be relevant?
Sure. Well, they turns out they have a lot to say. And if you just open up, this book really to any of the selections, you'll find that they're taking the world of theory and they're really tying it to a practical application, because these were gifts for very busy statesmen. And so they needed it dumbed down, so to speak, so that they could really quickly implement it. But I think the most important thing that you see going back to ancient Persia, when Xenophon is describing the education of Cyrus, you see in ancient China with Han Fei's writings, and you see it in India with Kautilya, they all start with the same thing, and that is self-control. A great leader must have self-mastery over their passions, whether that's food, drink, any addiction, any other thing. Even if it's their pride, they must have self-control. And they think it's universally, they would say it's impossible to have a great leader who doesn't have self-control. So that is a foundational principle. And I think it's, ultimately aligns quite well with the advice in the Christian world about pursuing virtue. This is something that's done, through trial and error at first. And oftentimes people don't want to become virtuous, but it does take practice. And eventually your actions and your desires will be ordered to follow your actions. But you really do, from a young age, really through education, have to practice that exercise in self-control. With Cyrus the Great back in ancient Persia, kind of Xenophon paints this portrait of this amazing, conquering, heroic leader. But then as soon as he dies, everything falls to pieces, right? Everything falls to pieces. And so it's a question about, was he really a good ruler if the moment that he's gone, he never built any institutions that were capable of preserving the prosperity and the liberty that he had established? And so I think at the end of the day, the reality is you need both great leaders and good institutions that are based on principles that endure the test of time. So I think to some extent, it's a chicken and an egg thing. What comes first? Unfortunately, I think the worse that the worse that conditions get in our own regime, the harder it is to claw them back through institutional means. It's kind of like pulling the emergency brake, right? So essentially what we have is Congress is doing whatever the administrative state is kind of running on inertia, and it's doing really whatever it wants. Congress really doesn't appear to be in much control over anything. And then you have the Supreme Court, I think, pulling the emergency brake on things. But that's really no substitute for, I think, the education and the character building that's ultimately needed to raise up the leaders who could restore the republic. And I do think that task of restoring the American republic will require, strong individual leadership, in ways that I think for periods of time, might make a libertarian feel uncomfortable. But I think the aim is to restore an order where ordered liberty is preserved. You're going to have someone who's going to fight, right, the oligarchy, and that will require strong leadership.
Well, we can think of Javier Milei in Argentina as an example I think libertarians would be comfortable with. And also, I think even though he was never in the executive branch, there's no doubt that in his own way, Ron Paul exhibited a kind of leadership in that he attempted to lead by example through his congressional votes, even if he voted all alone. He did that a lot, 434 to 1, an awful lot. If it's 380, to 55, well, nobody really cares. But if it's 434 to 1, you wonder, who's that guy? It makes you wonder. And so in a very different way from, I think, the way some of these statesmen exerted leadership, he exerted it in a unique way in that he got young people to read big treatises on economics. I don't think anybody Machiavelli advised ever got to quite that level.
That is true. I do there for the libertarians, in the audience, Machiavelli does have this line. So throughout this tradition, you do see a frequent, and it's recurring. You see it in Cicero all the way to Machiavelli, warnings about you should keep taxes low. Don't have taxes be too high, or else the people will hate you. And you're gonna quash kind of the economic engines of growth in the regime. And there's a funny line from Machiavelli, and he says, "A man will sooner forgive you if you kill his father than if you take his land." It's a little bit hyperbolic, but it kind of gets to the point of every great leader is to understand that you cannot be too overbearing with taxes. And Cicero also makes a strong defense of private property, and he's really, really skeptical of populist demagogues trying to kind of despoil the rich and redistribute the wealth. And so you can certainly find a lot of libertarian themes in many of these great classic writers.
I thought San Francisco was a nut house, and it is, but New York City sounds even crazier than that. Put on this first clip. Now, we'll start out with a tweet because I think it's a good explanation. There are two crazy things about this program. Now, City Council calls for an investigation of Mayor Adams' plan to give illegals $10,000 debit cards. The $53 million contract would give Mobility Capital Finance, who the mayor touts as minority-owned, lots of fees for services. And Ryan James Grodowski, I think he's a conservative writer, he says Mayor Adams' reason for offering $53 million no-bid contract to a company to distribute the $10,000 debit cards to migrants is because it's a minority-owned business. So you almost have a twofer here, because on the one hand, you've got the craziest of just handing people, oh, you're new to town? Here's $10,000
We stole the money, but don't worry about it.
Exactly, go ahead. And then Mayor Adams offered a no-bid contract to a company, and they're going to pocket $53 million for handing out cards. Oh, it's a minority-owned business. So you have the wokeness of the minority-owned business, and apparently they've never done anything like this before. I have a couple of clips about it. And you have the craziness of handing out this free money for everyone. And they're refillable. Like you say, if you run down a little bit, well, they'll top you back up.
Well, I think this president we have likes the idea and the principle of democracy. Yeah. But this sounds more like tyrannical management. They take the money from somebody and pass it off and buy the votes, and then they say, well, you don't have to repay it. It's a tyrant running thing. But Biden isn't the first one. It's the whole system that is like that. But he might be right now targeted because they're so blatant, and just like that minimum wage, is part of it too. Out in California, when I first heard of the minimum wage, okay, it was $253. It needs to be up to $10. I said, well, why don't you make it 15? Oh, well, right now it's just a little bit too much. So right now it's up to 50. I think that even shocked the most pro. Holy man, we could get that. But it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not a good economic policy, but it's not good moral policy. And I think it's a mixture. I think the morality of a wealth redistribution on purpose to help one group against the other one, that starts it off, and then you run into all these economic factors.
Yeah, wrong. And this came in by way of Politico. 4 myths about Ukraine that might sound wrong, might sound right, but they're actually wrong. So I messed that up. But 4 myths that they kind of sound right, but no, trust us, they're wrong. And so who are the authors? Let's put the next one up. Eric Edelman. Now, he was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in 2005 and 2009. That's during Bush. That's during the surges in Afghanistan and Iraq, the counterinsurgency war that did nothing. You remember Dr. Paul over and over again, the Fred Kagans of the world coming up to the hill saying, we're almost there, guys, just a little bit more. Well, this is the swamp. This is the soup that these guys were in. The second guy's even worse, David Kramer. Now, he worked for John McCain. John McCain, as you know, Dr. Paul was the one who instigated the Maidan coup in Ukraine. So he started the whole thing. Now he's director of the George W. Bush Institute. I'm sure that is a beacon of intelligent thought. And he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova from 2005 to 2008. So he is steeped in the milieu of regime change in Ukraine with the ultimate goal of regime change in Russia. That's where they're coming from. Anyone who just reads their bio shouldn't read any further. Here's how the media frames it. Ukraine's withdrawal from Avdiivka is an advance towards victory. So maybe these guys are right. If losing a town brings you closer to victory, then maybe they're right.
The march is on.
The march is on, yeah. So that's number one. Skip ahead to number two. Myth two is it's time for a ceasefire. This is the one that I find a little bit disgusting because these guys are very comfortable in D.C. Trust me, they've got nice houses. And these other guys that are in the trenches, it's a nightmare. But no, guys, you keep doing it. You keep staying in the trenches.
And I can't even find one of these four where the president might be right on.
Yeah.
He's wrong on all these things.
Yeah.
But so are the neocons and the Republicans that push all this stuff.
Yeah.
But there is a growing group, though, in Congress right now are getting pretty tired of it and not dealing at all with the borders, which is just an additional problem for us.
Yeah. Well, myth three, and we got to go back. I'm sorry, I messed up the order. But myth three, this is almost laughable. It's a myth that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. How dare you? There's a myth that Ukraine is a corrupt country led by neo-Nazis. Well, if you can go to, I literally at random did a quick search before the show. Do that first. These are Breitbart too, which is a super pro-war publication. Just a couple of examples. Zelensky purges 9 top officials as Ukraine corruption allegations linger. And do the next one. New York Times wakes up to corruption in Ukraine as officials admit military contract money has vanished. So this is a right-wing Breitbart, So it's just a myth, though. It's just a myth.
Well, they would point out the election in 2019. That was cleaning up the act of our intrusion and our coup. So Poroshenko, who was supposedly an elected leader, but he was our appointee. So they have an election, and they sort of beat him pretty hard. But and then they want to argue. Well, this is an example that that it's corrupt. But that's the part. So many, we don't have to go very far to find something what is corrupt. In many ways, the whole principle of some of these elections, the way they run, they're corrupt at core. What if it's all based on lies? Isn't it corrupt? It's based on economic lies. It's based. You think these are lies, or what are they? But if some people will look at that and say, well, they're diehards, and they agree with the complaint here.
Yeah. Well, we even heard Victoria Nuland. She was on tape saying we've invested $5 billion in Ukraine. So they're picking and choosing who's running. But here, let's do the last myth though, because this is kind of again unintentionally hilarious. Myth 4: Ukraine is the wrong priority. How dare we say that? It brings us to the final myth, namely that supporting Ukraine distracts from where we should really be concentrating our efforts. Of course, China and the Middle East. But here's the funny thing. Here's their rationale. That's why this is wrong. Ukraine is the right priority. And why is that? We'll go to the next one. It's the right priority because Russia invaded a neighboring state. Russia invaded someone out of the blue. How unintentionally hilarious, because these guys served under a president who invaded Iraq based on lies completely out of the blue. So,
these people should be told, if you feel strongly about this, we as constitutionalists and libertarians, we don't want to draft you or send you to have you do or deny it, but you can pick up your rifle or do what you want. You can go over there and do it. But there's not too much of that goes on.
They're not big.